Hey class, in this Godot Lab, this is lab 5, we're going to be adding obstacles to our game scene. So we're going to finally kind of have the last bit of functionality for our game before the midterm. We're just going to add some sound after this. But so for today, we're going to add some new art. You can choose one of the obstacles, or if you want to add multiple, I'll talk about how to do that. And we're going to add some animations, and then we're going to hook those things up to create an obstacle that is going to kind of end the game if the player runs into the obstacle, but we'll also give the player the ability to avoid or to kill or destroy the obstacle. So there's a few different options about ways to do this, and we'll take a look at the script and everything that goes along with it. First, we're going to have to download some assets as usual. On the class lectures page, if you scroll down to the bottom, as usual, I have a link to a Lab 5 archive, and this has a few files in it that you're going to add into your old project. So if you click on that, it should automatically download. If you're on Mac like I am, it may open it for you, or you can just double click on the file to open the archive. If you're on Windows, you may need to do the right click and then extract all, and you can put those files directly into your project, or you can put them in the downloads folder and then move them over. I'm going to duplicate my previous lab as I have done in previous examples. You can just add to the lab that you already have if you want to do that. But since I like to kind of keep things organized, I'm going to duplicate this lab for now. So I'm going to take lab 4 and hit Command D and make a copy. I'm going to change this to lab 5. So again, you guys can just like keep working on the lab that you already have. You don't really need to duplicate unless you want to keep things organized like I have them. So we need to make sure to put these files in the right places. There's 3 files in here. There's a script, obstacle.gd, that's going to go into the scripts folder, and there shouldn't already be a script in there, so it should just go straight in with no problem. Then there's player.gd. This is a new player script that adds some functionality for when the player hits the obstacle. So we're going to drag that in, and we're going to click replace to overwrite our old player script. The last file that we have in here is a Godot scene. You can see it's .tscn, and that's going to go in the scenes folder. So I'm going to click on scenes and drag this over. Okay, so that's all of the assets we need from the archive. So I can go ahead and delete that if I want to from my downloads folder. We're also going to need some new art. So before you get started, you should hopefully already have some obstacle art from the assignment. If you don't, you are going to want to make some before you start the lab. I made a few different things, so I'll go over what I made. So I'm going to go to my Piskel app and go to my gallery. You might be using different software for this, so you can just go there. So the first thing that I made is I made like a death animation for my character. So if he hits the obstacle, he's just going to die. And we'll add other possibilities for that after the midterm. But for now, we're just going to end the level right there. So we can take a look at that art that I made. It's very simple. It's just 3 frames just to communicate that you died, and then you can either quit the game or start over. So I'm going to export that file first. And I want to make sure to match the scale. So you might want to check your previous animations. I'm going to go with the scale is 2 because that's what I used before when I exported my player. And I'm going to download this sprite sheet. Okay, so then I'm going to go back to my gallery, and then I made 4 different versions of my enemy animation. So I made this little snake guy, pretty basic, just little enemy. And I'm going to download each one of those. So the first one is just his idle animation. He's just kind of sitting there. The snake is going to be moving a lot, so you're not going to see this animation very much, but there does need to be an idle animation for some circumstances. So I'm going to go ahead and export. This one is a little bit larger, so I'm going to scale it down. I'm just going to put scale at 1. You can always go back and change this if you want to change the scale, as you guys know. So I'm going to download my snake idle and then go back to the gallery. So then I also have a few other states. So if I want my snake moving around, which is what's going to be happening most of the time in my game scene, I need a walk animation or run or jump or whatever. So I'm going to export this walk animation that I made. and then go back to the gallery. I also have an animation for when the snake attacks. This is kind of optional. If you don't really want to have this part, you can just leave it out. You might get some errors in the code, but we can fix those pretty easily. So if you decide to leave out the attack animation, or if you want your your obstacle to do something else, we could go over how to do that. So I'm going to go with the scale is 1 again, and this is a pretty simple animation. And I want to make sure that, again, just like my player, the obstacles are going to be set up similarly to the items in the players. All of our animations have to be the same size for it to look right. So I'm going to download this snake attacking animation and then go back to my gallery. And I have one more. This is if I, as the player, jump on the snake, and then the snake will die. So depending on what your obstacles are, you might not have, like, the obstacles might not specifically die. They might just disappear or something like that. So you could change this animation. And if you have other ideas for how you want this to work, we could go over that. I'm just going to download this. So I have basically 5 new sprite animations that I'm going to include in my scene in Godot. So you don't necessarily need all 5, but you are going to need at least a couple of them. And so if you're not sure which to add, let me know and we can go over it. So I think I've got all of my new sprites. I'm going to select these and drag them into my sprites folder. And now I should be able to get started. And I just want to be careful to make sure they're in the sprites folder. Another thing that's helpful in the sprites folder, notice that my names always have the name of the thing that I'm drawing at the beginning and then the different states at the end. So it's snake attack, snake die, snake idle, snake walk. And that makes it a little bit easier for organization. I could use folders here, but at least this way I know that all the snake images are in the same place. So I'm ready to go. I'm going to go back and double click on my project.godot. If you're on Windows and you don't have that set up, you may need to open Godot and then open the folder. But if you're on Mac, or if you have Godot set up like that on your Windows, you should be able to just double click. And so I'm going to go and change the project name here. You probably don't need to do that, but I just want to make sure we know which project we're on. So this is Lab 5, and this is Obstacles. And so I'm going to close and save that scene. And so the first thing we're going to do is actually update our player animation. This part is pretty straightforward. It's just adding another animation to the player. So let's go ahead and do that before we get into our obstacles. So I'm going to go to my player scene, and I just have to go to my animation player and add a new animation here, just like I did in the past. I'm going to go to my small view so we can see everything here. So for this, I'm just going to add a new sprite. So I'm going to go to player and click the plus and type in sprite and go to sprite and create. And then we want to make sure to call this die. So that's what the sprite's going to be doing. It's for when our player dies. So we're going to call that die. And that actually has to match the code. So, if you don't have the player dying, if you have something else happening, you can still name it that, or you could change the code if you prefer. If we go into the code, the new player code, you can see down here that it's going to look for that animation die if we hit the enemy. And we'll go into over that a little bit more later. So let's go back to our scene. And so we're just going to add in this die animation the way that we would with any other animation. So I'm going to zoom in on my player, going to go to animation and click new, and this is die. Okay, and this part is a little bit tedious since we're using the animation player. We're going to use a different method with the enemy obstacle. So we'll go over that in a second. So first I'm going to go here and add my texture. I'm going to go to load, go to sprites, and find my character dies and click open. And then just set my animation frames. So there's 2 vertical frames, 2 horizontal frames. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to save that. As usual, I forgot to change the import state. So I'm just going to go and find my new images and turn filter off. So I'm just going to do that with each one of my new images. The rest of my images should already be set to filter off. And again, this is just for pixel art. If you're not using pixel art, you can probably skip that step. So let's go back to my die animation, and I'm just going to add in my track. So let's start with changing the visibility. So this one is a little tedious, which is why, since we don't need to have quite as much control over the animations for the obstacles necessarily, we're going to use an animated sprite instead, because it means that we don't have to go through this whole process for those. But since we need a little bit more control over our player animation, we're just going to go ahead and add these keyframes in here. So I'm making all of the keyframes, making all of the sprites except for the die sprite invisible when the die sprite animation starts. And then finally, the actual die sprite visibility is going to be toggled to on. And so I'm just going to insert a keyframe there. I'm gonna drag this window up a little bit so I can see that. So then with the die sprite itself, we can just go ahead and keyframe in the first frame, and it'll ask me if I want to add a new track, and I'm just gonna say yes and create. And we only have 3 frames for this, so I'm gonna make this 0.6 seconds long. And I'm actually not gonna click the loop button for this one, since when the player dies, we don't wanna keep looping that over and over again. So I'm gonna skip up to, let's zoom in a little bit. I'm going to skip up to 0.2 seconds and then increase the frame to 1 and keyframe that. And then let's go to 0.4 and increase to 2. And so that's the animation that will play when the character dies. So I'm going to save that. One thing I have to do is turn off the die animation in my other animations. So this is a little tedious, and this is why we're going to look at using the animation, this animated sprite for our obstacles, so we don't have to do this for every single animation. But let's switch back to our idle animation and just go back to the first frame, turn off the die animation, and go to visibility, and just keyframe in that that's off. So I'll just do that with my jump and walk really quickly. Just make sure that die is turned off. Add a new keyframe, search for visible, and keyframe off. Okay, and there's just one more. So again, this is a bit tedious, but because my player animations require a little bit more, are a little bit more complicated, I want to have the animation player instead of the animated sprite. Okay, so that's everything that I needed to do there. So we're not going to see that implemented for a little bit. We're going to go work on our obstacle for a second, but we will see that when we preview the scene in a little bit. I'm going to scroll up and collapse my sprites, and let's open up our obstacle scene. So I built this scene. It's a bit of a complicated scene. It's probably the most complicated element. It's much more complicated than the item. You can see there's actually 4 different colliders here, and I'm going to go over each one of those, and then we're going to add in our animations as well. So let's do that now. One thing that we're going to start to talk about is using a scene and an instance. We did that a little bit last week with the items, but let's talk a little bit more about what that really looks like here as we do our obstacles. So I'm going to do a little drawing. So our scenes have this sort of like blueprint quality. Whoops. We can think of them as kind of a blueprint for an obstacle, an object, a player, something like that. With the player, we only have one, so it's, we only make one version of it. But with our obstacles and our items, we make a lot of instances. So we have a scene, and that has like some animation, and it has a collider. It has these properties that are common to each one of the objects in the scene. But then when we place our enemies or our obstacles into the scene, we use what's called an instance. Okay, so an instance is just one copy of our blueprint. And so for me, I have this little snake guy. There's a little snake. So that's the first instance. And then there's another one. And then there's another one. And when we make instances, they get to share the basic properties of the blueprint. They're all going to use the same animations, but we can make changes. For example, I could change the color, I could change the speed, and I could change the direction. So there's these instances that have different properties, but they share some properties. Okay, so we want a blueprint for everything that's the same, but then we want instances for things that we're going to change. And so when we add our obstacles in our scene, we're going to see how that works. So let's go over everything that's in here, and then we're going to add everything to the scene. So we have a kinematic body as the main node for our obstacles, because they're going to be moving, so they need to have like gravity and physics and stuff like that. So just like the player is a kinematic body, our obstacles are kinematic bodies. You might have an obstacle that's not going to move, and there's an option for that. You can see over here in our script variables, there's a few options that are going to affect how our instances work. So if you have one that's just sitting there, like, you know, like a spiny thorny cactus or something like that, you can just turn off use movement, and then all the rest of this stuff is just going to be ignored. You can also have obstacles or enemies that will either fall off a platform or move back and forth on a platform. So that's another option. You can change the speed. You can change the direction, and then there's also a button down here that will only activate the obstacle when a player arrives. So we'll look at all of those options as we build this out. Let's start by just adding in our animations, however, and then we'll see how they interact with the scene. So our first thing in here is an animated sprite, and you can see I've already got set up the attack, the die, the idle, and the walk animations. If you want to change some of these animations, we can talk about how to do that, but these are kind of the default different states that you can use with an obstacle. If you have movement turned off, then you don't really need a walk animation. It's never going to be triggered. But as long as you're using movement and other things like that, you're going to want to have these in here. So let's add in our animations. So I'm going to click the attack animation. It's just at the top. I'm going to click on the little waffle to add some frames. And then I'm going to go into sprites and then find my snake attack animation and click open. So then here I'm going to change the horizontal and vertical frames until, excuse me, this matches. So it's a little bit small because my art is small, but if we zoom in, we can see that that's matching. And then I only actually have 3 frames in this animation, so I'm not going to click this last frame. I'm going to click add 3 frames. So for the attack animation, you can see that the speed is 4 and loop is set to on. And that sounds good. I'm going to leave it that way. If you want your snake to only attack once, you might turn loop off. But for me, I'm going to leave that. That looks pretty good. Next, we're going to go to the die animation, and we're going to click the waffle and find the snake die and click open. This one's also just 3 frames. So we have 2 horizontal frames, 2 vertical frames. You should just, if you have more frames in your animation, just make sure that this looks right, that you're kind of like each frame is divided up into a different box. So I'm going to click on my 3 frames. Notice here that the speed is also 4. The loop is toggled off. So if it's on the left, that means the loop is off. So when the snake dies, I don't want to keep looping that animation over and over again. If you think that, you know, that might be kind of funny, you could add that in there, but I have that turned off. Next, I'm going to go to idle, and I'm going to choose my waffle again and choose my snake idle. And in my scene, you're not going to see the idle very much, but if you have like a static obstacle, like a wall or a spike or something like that, you know, it might be on idle the whole time. So I have 4 frames. I'm going to choose each of those frames, and that looks pretty good. If you want to preview the animation while you're working on these, you can hit playing is on. And then you're going to see whatever animation is toggled up here. So there's the die animation. Here's the idle animation. So that's a way that you can just preview what's happening. It's not going to be set that way when you actually play the scene. Then let's go to our walk animation, and let's click on the waffle and go to snake walk and open it up. And so this is 2. This is 2. We're going to click here, 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 choose those frames. And then that looks good. I'm going to save these. This is set to loop. This speed is a little faster since it's walking. I want it to like look a little bit faster, but you can play with the speed here. That's the speed of the frame animation, not the speed of the object in the scene. So let's change to walk and turn it on. And that looks pretty good. I didn't spend a ton of time on this art, obviously, just kind of making some defaults for us to look at. Okay, so now that I've got everything set up, I need to set my colliders a little bit. Let's do that now. So I'm gonna turn off some of these colliders so we can see what they each do. So there's one that's just called collider, and this is our physics collider. Let's actually turn off the floor check for now as well. And so this is the thing that makes the art interact with the environment, like the platforms and stuff. You'll notice if you click on this collider that under, actually it's going to be on the obstacle layer, but it's using this as the collider for the obstacle. So on the obstacle layer, notice that the layer is just set to enemy. So that's what layer this is on. We talked a little bit about layers and masks in the item video last week, so you could review that if you need to. Then in your mask, we need to just choose the objects that this layer interacts with. So with our enemy or obstacle, we only want to interact with the player and the platforms. We don't need to interact with other items, and we don't need to interact with other enemies. You might choose that the enemies can like bump into each other. That if you just click on enemy here, that will actually make the enemies bump into each other. You could also do that in the instances to see that the enemies will bump into each other, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So then for my collider, let's turn that on, and we just want to make sure that that interacts with the art in a way. This is not actually how it will collide with the player. This is how it's going to collide with the platforms and other walls and stuff. So we want to move the collider down a little bit to match the art at the bottom. And then if we want to, increase the collider, we want to make sure this edge is where if it runs into a wall, it's going to turn around. So we don't want the edge to be too far outside of the art. And if you want to play the animation while you're doing this, that might be a good way to see if it matches. But usually with a collider like this, I would default on the art going outside rather than inside. I think that'll look more realistic. So I'm gonna try to kind of center this here. And I think that looks pretty good. You should move yours around with the art. You can actually also change the collider to a rectangle shape if you prefer that. If you do that, there's one line of code that you're gonna need to change. So if we go over to the script and look at the obstacle, some of the stuff that the script is doing is based on the idea that your collider is a circle. The main thing with that is this line right here, line 19. It's doing this other thing that we'll talk about in a second based on the idea that the collider is a circle. So you can see it has get radius. If your collider needs to be a square, then you should use this line above here where it's using get extents.x. So that's based on the rectangle shape, not the circle shape. If you're having trouble with that, let me know and we can go over it. So let's go back to our scene. So we have our collider. That looks pretty good. Just gonna leave that there and I'm gonna lock it. Okay, so let's go. Now we have this thing called the floor check. And this is basically just making sure that the obstacle is still on the floor. This is only necessary if your obstacle is moving back and forth or your enemy is moving back and forth. What this is going to do is if we reach the end of a platform, instead of just falling off, it will turn around. And so that's another option. If you have that turned off, it's just going to ignore it. One thing that you do have to do with this floor check is you have to make sure that the top of this arrow goes below your art. So you can see mine is just like overlapping just a little bit, or actually, sorry, the collider. The art doesn't matter. What matters here is your main collider. So whatever the collider is, your arrow has to go below that. So if your collider is a lot bigger than mine, you can go to the arrow and make it larger, like 40. As long as it's just a little bit bigger, that's all you need. So it's checking below where the collider is. So that looks pretty good. That should work. We'll test it in a minute and then, kind of tweak things. So actually, I think we have enough to get started with some testing. So let's add an instance to our scene and see how it works. So I'm going to go to my main scene and I'm going to scroll. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And let's just add an instance of this snake. So you could add it, anywhere in the scene you want. I'm going to put mine on the main platform just so I can get started testing really easily. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And the way I'm going to add an instance is just like I have my items node with all my items in here. I'm first going to add a new node. So I'm going to go to main scene, click plus, and this is just a node 2D. So I'm going to type in node 2D and hit enter. And then I'm going to rename this. So I'm going to hit enter to rename it. And I'm going to call this obstacles. You could call it enemies. If you have multiple different kinds of enemies, you could say like, this is my, spikes and this is my fireballs or whatever it is. So then inside my obstacles, I'm going to click the link or instance, and I'm going to choose obstacle and click open. And that's going to add an obstacle up here. So let's move him over here. I'm going to put him up here with the player so we can kind of see them falling at the same time. And so let's take a look at some of the options with the enemy. So right now at this point, you've actually kind of done most of the work because the code is really doing everything else with the enemy, but let's go over some of the options. So if I don't touch anything else, look what is going to happen. So if I press play on the scene, so my enemy is just going to fall to the ground and then it's going to start moving and it's going to attack the player and kill the player. So if you've set up everything, that's what it should look like. We might need to set up a signal because it should actually be ending the game, but we'll take a look at that in a second. But that's kind of like the default, way that it works. If you don't want your enemy to move, that's kind of the first option. You can just turn off use movement. What you're going to see happen now is that the enemy is just going to stay in the place, where it is the whole time. Okay, so in this case, the player isn't going to run into the enemy unless I go up here, and then it'll still kill the player. So if you want to have a static enemy, you can just put them wherever in the scene and turn off the movement. You could also add animation and have it move back and forth or up and down or something like that. There's a lot of stuff you could do. If you want to get really creative and make the enemies jump and stuff like that, you might need to add some code. But your enemy doesn't have to act exactly the way mine is set up to act. If you want to add some changes, let me know and we could talk about how to do those. So let's look at some of the other options. So let's turn movement back on. Another option that you have is whether or not you want the enemy to stay on the platform. So let's actually move this enemy over here. And I'm going to turn off stay on platform. And then if I hit play again, it's just going to fall off the edge of the platform. And so you may want that if you have like some enemies later that are coming this way. They could fall off the edge of the platform and then they could attack you. If you don't want that to happen, just turn this on. And what we'll see now is that the enemy is actually going to hit the side and then turn around. Notice that the art also turns around. That's all built into the code. If you have different animations that you want to play based on the direction, that's something that we could also look at. So we can also change the speed of the enemy. So the default speed is 50. If I make this like 100, we'll see that the enemy is going to go a lot faster. Okay, so it's going to make it, in some ways it's actually easier to avoid a faster enemy because if I jump up at the right time, well, I didn't do it there, but if I jump at the right time, then the enemy will pass under me faster. So some ways faster enemies are easier, but in some ways they're harder because they come at you faster. You can change the speed of different instances if you want to do that. The next item is the direction. -1 is going to be to the left. If I want to go to the right, I just change this to 1. Pretty straightforward. 0 will make your enemy not move, so don't do 0 unless you want that to happen. But yeah, basically you can just change the direction like that. So notice that it doesn't actually change the direction of the enemy in the editor, but it does as soon as we see it happen. The last option says activate on player. This is based on the really long collider that we saw before, but basically, let's turn that on so we can see it real quick. This is the player detect collider. And so if we look at that, okay, that's good. We can see that it doesn't quite hit the player. So what you'll notice here is that the enemy is actually not going to move unless the player enters that area. So this is like, you know, the snake doesn't really know that you're there, but as soon as I come over here, then the snake knows that I'm there. So that's another option. The default is that for that to be off, so the snake is just going to move regardless of whatever else is going on. And if you want to change how big that detection area is, just go into the obstacle and unlock this collision shape, and then you can drag it out. You could make it so it's only in front of the enemy. You know, whatever you think is the best for the design of your game is what you should do there. I'm going to lock this again. And we'll come back to this in a second. So then let's look at another aspect. So that's basically all the defaults. If you have other ideas for stuff that you want to do with your obstacles or your enemies, let me know and we can try adding it into the code. Another thing I can do with my obstacle, of course, is change the color. So if I want to make this snake, you know, kind of green, I can do that. And the nice thing about this is with instancing, I can have different colors of enemies if I want. So let's make another obstacle. I'm going to take this obstacle, hit Command D to duplicate, and I'm going to move this guy over here. And so for this one, we'll leave the direction as left. We'll leave everything else the same. But let's actually go ahead and change the color just a little bit. So this is an easy way to add some, you know, little variations to the game is by changing the color. So now I'm going to have two different enemies with the same behaviors but different colors, and they're going to start attacking me as soon as the scene starts. Notice that they pass by each other. They should both bounce off the walls or the sides. So that's good. And then I got killed. Again, if you want the enemies to actually hit each other, that's something that we can set in our kinematic body 2D, in our physics collision. And we can just change, all we have to do is say that we want the enemy to also run into each other. So we can change that there and go here and choose the enemy here and save that. And so now, hopefully, if that works correctly, oops. Oh, you know what? Actually, that's not going to work because the enemy's colliders are overlapping. So that's another thing that we can fix and talk about for a second. So now that we've seen all the different functionalities of the enemy, let's go ahead and go over those colliders in a little bit more depth. So I'm going to go back to my obstacle scene. So let's turn this off and go through our other colliders real quick. So I'm going to go, so we already talked about the floor checker if we go off the different sides. Let's now look at the top checker. So one thing to point out is our collision mask. So for our top checker, this actually only collides, this layer is still the enemy, but this only collides with the player. The top checker is to see if the player landed on the head of the enemy. Let's actually view this now. And that's how you can actually beat the enemy. I didn't actually show that, so let's try to do that real quick. So if I time this right and I jump on the enemy, he'll disappear. So pretty straightforward. That animation is kind of slow, so maybe I would speed that up a bit. But that's basically what this top check is going to do. You can see it's overlapping a little bit with the collider, which is why I think the enemy was like killing itself at the beginning. I'm not really sure what happened there. But you can move this around to match your art a little bit. So I might move this up a bit and then make sure it kind of overlaps here. Oops. Let's lock up our animated sprite so we don't move it. And go back to our collision shape. And then mine can actually be a little bit smaller. So that looks pretty good. So if my player jumps up and lands on the enemy in that area, it's going to hit that enemy. And all we have to do is make sure the 2D area that contains the collision shape has the right layer and mask. If you don't see like player, platform, item, enemy when you open these, that means that you haven't set that up in your project settings. I should have mentioned this earlier. We did that in an earlier video. If for some reason you don't have that set up, it's pretty easy to do, but it also doesn't really matter. That's just like a nice label, but as long as your mask and layer cells are correct, like if you have clicked on the right ones, it doesn't really matter what they're actually called, but it does make it easier to edit. So the way that you do that is in project settings, scroll down to 2D physics, and then you can change the layer names here. And you can just set it up to make it a little easier to understand. I already have the layers set up in a specific way, so if it's not working, that may be one of the problems, and we could go over how to do that. So that's the top check to make sure that to see when the player kind of jumps on the enemy. We next have a sides check. So I'm gonna lock up the top check. Let's go to the sides check. So if I turn this guy on, this is a collider that goes on both sides of the enemy. If the player attacks or walks from either side, the player is going to die. You could make it on just the front. You could make it on just the back. You know, you could do whatever you want with this. But basically, if the player interacts with this area, that's going to kill the player. So I'm going to edit this just a little bit. I'm going to bring it down. And you want to make sure this matches the art. You don't want it to be like totally out of whack, but we also want it to go a little bit, you know, outside of the head collision and the kinematic body collision. So the kinematic body collision, the thing in the center, that's what actually interacts with the platforms and other elements in the scene. The areas, they don't actually like stop anything moving from them. They're not kinematic, so they don't stop the player from entering, but they do trigger when the player enters. And that's what this little signal is in the sides check. So we'll look at those signals in a second as well. And then the last collider that we have, let's lock up this guy. The last collider that we have, which we already kind of looked at, is our player detect collider. And again, this is just an area, so it doesn't block anything from coming in, but it detects when the player comes in. And again, if you want to change where that player detection occurs, just change the shape. You can make it a circle. It really doesn't matter. It's just detecting on whether something enters or not. So I think that's actually basically it. Let's talk a little bit about the code, just so you guys can see what that looks like. But this is pretty much everything that we need to have going. So there's a few different signals in here. So let's look at those first. So if we look at the top check, you can see there's a signal there. And if we go over to the node, you can see it's a body entered. So that means when the player enters the top check. And we don't actually have to specify that it's the player because we have the mask set up that it's only looking for the player. If for some reason other things can kill your obstacles, like falling rocks or something like that, you can just add that to the mask. And it doesn't really matter. As long as you have the mask set up correctly, you don't actually have to check what is interacting. So inside this function, where we see on top check body entered, so that is the body of the player. Again, that's the only thing that it's going to be looking for. So the first thing that it does is it's going to set the is alive value of the obstacle to false. And what that does is it stops updating the physics. It stops updating, you know, other things. So the obstacle will stop moving if it is in fact moving. Then it's going to play this die animation. So if you don't have a die animation, you might get an error here. You could just cut this line of code or add in a die animation. The next thing it does is it actually sets all of the collisions and masks to false. So that prevents multiple collisions from happening. So if we're still in the same area, it's going to keep detecting that collision. But if we just turn that layer off and that bit mask off, you know, it's going to stop collecting. So we can just stop detecting any other things happening. So that's pretty much all that happens here. But one really nice bit of code for Godot is since we're playing this animation, that is actually hooked up to another signal. So if we go to our animated sprite, you can see there's a signal there. And when the animation is finished, it does this other bit of code. So let's take a look at that. I don't know why my animation thing just came up here. So here, on animation finished, if the obstacle is not alive, so that means that the player landed on top of the obstacle, we use this Q free line to just take that object out of the scene. If you want your obstacles, like the dead bodies or whatever, to just like pile up in the scene, just delete this whole function or comment it out. But that's what makes the snake disappear after you jump on it. So let's go to the next one, the sides check. That signal is also bodied entered. And if we click on that, we go to this part of the code. And here we have, looks like I called this front check. That must have been from something I was doing earlier, but as long as it's connected, it doesn't really matter. You can change that if it bothers you. This is going to play the attack animation. If you don't have an attack animation, just delete this, or if you want it, create the attack animation. This is also going to set the speed to 0. So if the snake attacks you, we want it to stop moving, but it's still alive, so we don't want to turn it off. So we're just setting the speed to 0 here. And then we're calling the body, we assume this is the player since that's the only thing that the sides collisions are looking for. And so then we just call this function enemy collision in the player. And what that does, if we go to our player script, it says enemy collision. Oh, I actually have a print line enemy in here. So that must have been from when I was writing this. We don't really need this in here, but it's not going to do any problems either. So this is actually going to set the player is alive to false. So that's the player, not the enemy. And then it's going to play the die animation for the player. And then that die animation, just like our obstacle, actually has an animation finished, and that is going to do the game over if the anim name is die. And I have another print in here, so let's get rid of that. And that signal I don't think is set up, so we'll do that next. This code we also don't need. I don't know why that's there. Okay, so let's go back to our obstacle. Finally, we have the player detect. That's really simple. It's another on-body entered signal, and basically it just says if if the player goes into this area, if we aren't already moving, then we're going to start moving. So that's pretty specific to how this obstacle works. If you have an obstacle that moves in a different direction, that's easy. We can change that. So then the last bit of stuff that we have to do is go to our player, find our animation player, and set up this signal. So this is on animation finished. It should already be in there. So just click connect, and we should see this game over code here. And that should be the last thing that we need to do. So in our main scene, if we click play, if we get hit, we're gonna die. And it looks like if we have 2 enemies, we can die twice. So we might need to update that code a little bit. But anyway, we get our game over scene and we can play again, which just brings us back into the scene. And so I can go over here. Oh, I actually hit that snake. So now I'm back in my scene, and if I die again, I'll die again. And if I hit this snake, we have a little direction issue. That's something I might need to fix, but for now, I think that's okay. And so, yeah, that's pretty much the whole thing. Let me know if you guys have any questions or you need to go over anything as you're working on this. But most of what you really need to do for this lab is just add in the art. Everything else is kind of set up. Once you have, a couple obstacles in the scene, you can start thinking about other places to put the obstacles and start actually like planning out your whole level. So that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions on Discord or whatever, and I'll see you guys in class.